there's so obviously just so much to discuss, so many questions that I could raise after those two talks, which, unlike the last two talks, actually worked sort of seamlessly together, both conceptually and historically as well. It's quite incredible. But
disturbing.
Yeah, disturbing. But brilliant stuff. And I think one of the things that we actually met to discuss areas of common interest before the talk. And in a way, the talks have kind of thrown the kind of questions that I had prepared open a little bit, because I think the introduction of, well, just going back, if we just backtrack a little bit, the introduction of Marx and the commodity form, which I'm always kind of pleased to hear about more, because often there's a sort of resistance about going back to Marx's Capital, and especially that first kind of passage in the book. And I think it's actually incredibly relevant today, more relevant today than ever before, and I think you both actually showed that very clearly. But one of the images from that book that stood out for me as you were talking, David, was just this image of the spinning table that Marx talks about. And I suppose there's a sense in which this idea of the abstraction of a table that's caught within the kind of market, that's caught within the economy and begins to move, is only possible through thinking that as a kind of abstract concept. Now, I think following on from that image, which you kind of in a way referred to, my question, I suppose, to you first of all is really just about the change in movement from the spinning table, and whether we can talk about a different type of speed associated with that spinning table, because something very different happens now in terms of this kind of gap between cause and effect and its relation to economy.
Wow, that's quite a question. I think it has to be slightly separated off. I mean, the image, as Marx uses it in the first chapter of Capital, is quite a specific image. It's not any old table. He's thinking of spiritualism, of course. I mean, he's thinking specifically of the kind of turning of tables in 19th century spiritualist practice. So there's one of the notorious aspects of the first chapter of Capital generally is Marx is drawing upon a kind of language of metaphysics and religion and spiritualism and so on to think about the nature of capital. And of course the idea of the fetish is fully embedded in that, with all its problems that are post-colonially apparent to us, but it's part of that network of images that make up that first chapter. I think there are a couple of interesting things in that. I mean, one is the persistence of that kind of animism of capital, and one of the reasons I was interested in that opening image in Michael Lewis's book is this idea of the line being alive as having its own desires and its own wants. The line is in some sense a figure for, I think, capital, reasonably explicitly in the book at that point. And that, of course, is a very long history of that, going back to Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, through Marx's spinning table, to what Keynes called animal spirits. That there's a persistent attempt to grasp capital as if it were a living creature. And I think that relates to that, to this problem of envisaging capital in that sense, that's one of the ways in which we try to envisage it, precisely because we can't pin it into an object itself. As soon as you look at the object as an object, in some sense its commodity nature disappears. It's one of the confusions, I think, still in a lot of the secondary work around what Marx means by fetishism. In a way, partly because Marx's account of fetishism is confused with Freud's account of fetishism. So that people tend to talk about commodity fetishism as if what Marx meant was something like the seductive display of objects in department stores or supermarkets. Actually, it's the absolute opposite. The point for Marx is that that's the sensuous quality of of the object, that what makes it a commodity is precisely its abstract, not an atom of matter enters into it, objectivity of values. So we tend to get commodity fascism precisely the wrong way round in that. So, Marx actually is surprisingly uninterested in commodity display. I guess he's writing at a fairly early stage, but still he was living in London and there were department stores and things. He's surprisingly unbothered by that. I think in terms of the temporalities and the speed, it's not, I suppose, the spinning of the table per se. That might be taking the animistic metaphor too far, but there is certainly a question that goes back, I think, to what we both picked up in regard to Ginsberg and the idea of traces and the kind of etiologies of that and the tracing back, to do with the different temporalities at which capitalism functions, and the clash between those different temporalities. And of course this is one of the problems around something like climate change, because the temporalities at stake in that, and certainly the temporalities of something like geological time, are so massively at odds with the temporalities under which capitalism works. I think what has changed to a degree over the last 20, 30 years, or that was always had some truth, but is that gap has always also widened massively between, as it were, political time in its narrow sense and economic time. The time at which things like government regulation, parliamentary forms and so on move, versus the time of capital accumulation. And that time of capital accumulation is reaching such a point of speed that it is literally incomprehensible by humans. Because it's run by algorithms, it's operating in nanoseconds, and this is the reason why you're laying down this crazy fibre optic line between Chicago and New Jersey, and that creates a real political as well as conceptual and critical problem.
I think that's one of the things that is also interesting in relation to the previous talk, as we were talking about these different models of thought and what something like the kind of model of the theatre allows for. One thing that perhaps it doesn't allow for is this notion of time, to think of time. And I think this is something that is particular to you as well, Adrian, with this idea of a kind of a multiple reading of different times, different epochs, looking back to, say, the geological time of the Anthropocene and before, and then thinking about the speed of kind of contemporary capitalist time and what it means to think of those different time zones, different experiences of time, different ways of conceptualizing time together. That seemed to come through.
Yeah, I think it's really uncanny, and when Juan opened up by saying, sometimes the speakers don't say what we think they're going to say. It felt like a very planned marriage of presentation, because I think the container was really the aerosol particle in some way. There were models of circulation, and they're trying to track a model of circulation and see what kind of falls out of it, literally, in your case. I think in the case of climate change, the point that you raise is really the key one, that the human sensorium is being confronted with things that are either becoming incredibly fast, as in the case of financialization, or are so spatially attenuated, as in the example I showed, in which aerosols are moving from one part of the world to the Sahel, or are taking place so slowly that unless they're represented in certain kinds of ways, are actually inaccessible to human experience. And I think that here we find a really fundamental, profound aesthetic question, which I think is absolutely fascinating, right? Is that how do we expand the human sensorium given these speeds and attenuations such that those kinds of phenomena can come back into experience? I think that's, and with the proviso, of course, that not that will automatically translate into political action or et cetera, but I think that's really, even though I was very critical of the idea of visibility, I think and I think we will both agree, it's still absolutely one front of struggle and invention, which is fundamentally important. So I think, that's I guess one side of it. I think on the other side, what you find is with those kinds of attenuations and let's say those kinds of complexities, what you're what we're seeing is a kind of a shift away from kind of evidence-based, or let's say a lack of confidence on the other side on reasoning, on simply the ability to reconnect those complex relationships, and a return to something which is just belief, and a kind of interest in different kinds of cosmological perspectives, because ultimately that what is at stake? No, it's that relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's a way in which the human being is trying to locate themselves with respect to different forces in the world, to make sense of the way forces are touching the soul or the body in different kinds of ways. And then what you see in those cosmological, or what you see in these kind of cosmological diagrams, I think is somehow fundamental, and when we have to return to that in some kind of way, because ultimately I think questions of belief become far more important, because we won't, or we simply can't have the kind of evidence or faith in forums or even in kind of scientific forms of reasoning to get us out of the mess that we're in. Now, that's a kind of a very speculative thought, and I have no sense of what those things will look like. But there's no other way to make sense of this kind of effectively what is action at a distance. Right. I mean, I think both presentations are somehow about actions at a distance that we can't, are very difficult to make sense of.
In a way, they also both touch on that figure that neither of you mentioned, but seem to be kind of there in the background, which is Frederick Jameson, and his kind of his notion of cognitive mapping and the challenge that we have in terms of mapping ourselves conceptually, economically, socially today. What kind of mode, what kind of form of representation do we need in order to conceptually map our place in the world? That image of mapping was, that now for many is now kind of a somewhat dated idea of sort of 80s postmodernism. Is it for you? Is that still a kind of relevant?
I think
image.
The problem is still a relevant one. I think the term was always the wrong one. I think he knew it was always the wrong one, James. So it's oddly taken from Kevin Lynch's work, which is a kind of rather nostalgic kind of desire for kind of rather straightforward forms of legibility. So it was always kind of peculiar. It's a bit, I think Althusser, when he got older, he said, he famously had this notion of the epistemological break thesis, and he said the only problem with the epistemological break thesis is it wasn't epistemological and it wasn't a break. And I think the same is true about cognitive mapping. The only problem with cognitive mapping is it isn't cognitive, it isn't a map. So it's, I think it correctly identifies the problem, and correctly identifies it, as both of us, I guess, are saying, as both an aesthetic problem or, and a political problem of how we situate ourselves.
Relationship to architecture is kind of particularly significant in that.
Yeah, although I mean, his own model of that was bewilderment, wasn't it? Because his own model of that was the experience of the Bonaventure, and it's the mimicry of the incapacity to locate yourself, which is a certain, I would rather still say, modernist experience, but it doesn't answer the kind of things that you're gesturing towards, which would be what would it mean to actually find different ways of envisioning this.
Only because I think the point of raising something like the trap in the end, and it's kind of just it's a very speculative thought still, is exactly to move away from that good faith in explanation and representation, right? And to say that in fact human life is organized by all kinds of solicitations that don't appear to us in the form of, maps, representations, explanations, etc., but simply act on us nonetheless. And so for me, this is a way of entering into questions of architecture outside of a kind of regime of intelligibility or interpretation. So things act on you regardless of whether they're intelligible to you or not. And I think for me, that starts to reorient the way we start to think about what it means to think creatively and politically and spatially, that doesn't rely on that kind of enlightenment, good faith of telling people how, or explaining how bad things are, which is nonetheless important. But
I mean, the final thing before we open up to questions, I think, was whether there was always some uncertainty about whether we get to this, but you both kind of left with a question about, well, is it possible to think of, essentially to think about alternatives with the level of abstraction that we were living within, an abstraction that's designed around a political system. Therefore, is it really possible to kind of think outside of that, beyond it, or develop some alternative to it? You didn't really answer that. You left with that question, and in a way, it's a sort of impossible question. I mean, I guess you left, from my perspective, you left that point by kind of actually saying, no, it's not. It's actually it's not something that we can.
I'm not sure I'd want to be quite so despairing about it. I think it's undoubtedly difficult, and it is difficult to envision what a kind of equivalent form of abstraction to something like capital would be. Although I think, in a much earlier stage, and in a sense a much simpler stage, I wasn't being entirely facetious at the end, that was in a sense something of what socialism sought to think. I think it sought to think it through the state predominantly as itself a kind of abstract form, or a form of society grounded in modes of abstraction that would be different to and in competition with those constituted by capital and the value form. The problem, obviously, as we all know, is that we've tended to lose faith for various reasons in that kind of state-based solution, and that seemed more plausible anyway in a world fundamentally organised around nations, and the kind of gradual dissolution of that, and climate change is, I suppose, in some sense representative of those problems. What would be the state-based solution to climate change? At some level, that seems precisely what's necessary. Almost the need for a kind of authoritarian global state that would just say you will no longer drive your cars. But it's impossible to politically, realistically imagine what that would actually entail. I suppose I still tend to think that it's going to have to be something like state-like structures. Let's put it as vaguely as that. But as you were saying at the very beginning, it's also politically it's a question of different scales, isn't it? And that's how. And I think. I suppose I'm reluctant to give up my enlightenment desire for reason, but I take your point, and I think there is that is precisely where it becomes a kind of aesthetic and political question in a strong sense, because one of the problems here, of course, and you see this very clearly in particularly in American political discourse around something like climate change, is it's the levels of abstraction that are involved in those modes of explanation have a hard time competing with the capacity to say, yeah, but it's snowing outside, so what are you worrying about? I can see it. Look, there's snow. That problem of the disparity between those two different models. Clearly, as we know, the latter one is wrong, and it's indeed stupid for all sorts of reasons. It has a certain kind of political pull that we presumably have to think of better ways of countering that than simply saying, no, that's wrong because climate isn't weather and so on. So,
But maybe the disparity between the models is exactly what's interesting, right? And I think maybe, I think for me, I wouldn't frame it in terms of capitalism also, but if we just thought about it in terms of quite specific anthropological models or technical models or models of organisms or environments, and the way that each one, because it's a model, is an abstraction. And ultimately they individuate each other through their encounter, through the disparities and the kind of conflicts between them. And maybe a slightly smaller scale way of thinking about it is that what would a kind of experimentation with those different kinds of models look like, with different forms of life, let's say, for different psychological, anthropological models, or different economic models, but also different technical models. Insofar as each model individuates the world in, a set of abstractions, has things that it considers relevant, things that exist in its blind spot, things that are visible to it, things that are invisible to it. And then I think what we find is, when we look closely at those situations, is really just the intersection of those kinds of models, whether, as in the case I showed, which is a relationship between, let's say, a shift in a kind of a model of like an indigenous population with respect to a shift in a certain kind of environmental model. I think for me that those things are enormously interesting, insofar as they just allow for a more concrete handle on differences, and maybe to say that ultimately there are different kinds of abstractions at work, and therefore those different kinds of abstractions can be a space of creative operation in some way.
I suppose it would be partly a question about the different modes of realizations of abstraction, and it's really different modes of the realization of models, abstract models in that sense. To what degree do they reform one layer of the world in some sense? I mean, part of the fascination for me with something like containerization is that it is so caught up with precisely that sense. The material processes that are going on are immensely complicated and involve immense amounts of labor and technology and so on. Entirely reliant upon this realization of abstract models, so that it really is seamlessly interlinked with data and with computers and so on. It's unfeasible without it for all sorts of reasons. So I guess what would be the kind of the political equivalence in some sense of that, of giving real form to models in a way that would allow us to envisage different futures through that.
I think that's a great question to ask in a design school.
I'm conscious of the time, and I think we should definitely open it up to the floor, because I'm sure we've got lots of questions, and I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask their question. Right, okay.
Microphone's
Hello, thank you. I was wondering, maybe I'm thinking a bit too small scale and in sculpture terms, but if abstract relations dictate the flow of material objects, I was just wondering if you thought, and also it's quite speculative, if you thought that certain material arrangements could reorganize the world of relations and of abstraction, if it could kind of come out of the material world, the other way around, just because obviously as a sculpture student you just wish that would happen rather than the other way around. I mean, I don't think it'll have a worldwide effect, but what about the material world having in architecture having a real effect on relations?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a terribly coherent answer to it. I mean, clearly it does all the time. I mean, and what materials can do and the nature of different materials determines the degrees to which those abstractions can be realized and modeled in various ways. The only thing I would say, I suppose, is, and the point of my rather loose analogy between money, containers and data packets as exemplary kind of contemporary forms in a sense, is that all of them are, I guess, designed to reduce the capacity for materials to interfere as much as possible. Now, it's questionable whether they can ever absolutely. Well, money does in a way. The others, since they are nonetheless material, a container is still a real material thing that has certain kind of limits. Means that I don't think it can ever remove that entirely, but certainly the pressure is to reduce it as much as possible through a principle of essentially exchangeability. That you have a standard size of container that everything you would want to send in a ship is able to go into, and then it doesn't really matter what that particular thing is. In the same way as a data packet is really just designed to reduce things to the most abstract form, so that the content, quote unquote, of it is rendered irrelevant. So I've ended up depressing answer there. I don't mean it to necessarily. I mean, because it does, clearly material things do interfere all the time various ways. And architecture is a good example. You can abstract models as much as you like, but then you've got to build it out of something, and that something is going to determine what you can actually do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Look, if you're imagining that the object is something kind of solitary and eviscerated of kind of relations and context, then maybe it's too much of a burden for the object. But if you understand the object as always entering into a field that's kind of saturated with existing protocols and attitudes and habits and modes of reception, etc., then you're working within that field. And of course it will push back on it in ways that you can, that you conceive of.
Thank you very much for these brilliant talks introducing us to, two of the maybe greatest challenges of our time, capital and climate change, or the Anthropocene. I had the feeling that you approached them also from two different paradigms. One, the paradigm of abstraction, and the other one, I would call it the paradigm of speculation. I was wondering, in both of your talks, I heard a slight, critique or concern how capable visual culture, that is the topic of the series, relates to it. Not to draw too many conclusions, but I'd say both of you had a kind of implicit thesis that visual culture in no way is capable of dealing with either the speculative paradigm that tries to approach climate change or the abstract paradigm of global capitalism. And the other, so that's question number one. So, chance for visual culture or not? Are there other chances? So I very much enjoyed the suggestion in the end concerning a model of a trap, which reminded me of a model strategic designer Benedict Singleton proposes. Beside the model of the trap, he proposes plot and outer space. David Cunningham, coming from literature, so are there alternatives of approaching speculation and abstraction?
Well, I mean, I'll start maybe. I think it's a correct observation to make that there is a kind of, at least in my presentation, I would say, a kind of skepticism. And to put it in the context, it's really, I've been working on that material in different forms for about 4 or 5 years, mainly looking at the histories of scientific image making. And I guess what you're seeing is me having more and more doubts around the capacity of not only scientific image making, just scientific reasoning in general. We don't want to do away with scientific reasoning at all. I'm a great lover of science, but just maybe more to understand its limits. And that's something that I'm working through, and that's what you detected in terms of this kind of skepticism. And so on one hand, I think there's a really critical project, as I said before, around this kind of question of the human sensorium. I think there's a really critical project around aesthetics and the way aesthetics are used to mobilize different kinds of truth claims within science and also within other fields. But for me, coming back to architecture and thinking more and more about the way architecture functions, and I find that those paradigms are less and less interesting for me, because in architecture, at least, they recapitulate, very postmodern arguments around legibility, which just kind of discussed, in which architecture is always, assigned to be interpreted, in different kinds of ways, and I think that's less useful, or not only less useful, but let's say it's one version of what architecture could do. But I think there's much more at stake.
I mean, in terms of the visual, I think it's more. I don't want to suggest I'm dismissing the visual. I mean, it's more knowing what it does and doesn't do, I suppose. I mean, or what its limits are. Because I think what I was trying to describe as the in a way the kind of social documentary mode, go take a photograph of something on the other side of the world, bring it back here, is still a very valuable one. I wouldn't want to dismiss that And there is a mode of visualizing something that is kind of hidden in that kind of process. It's a question of what can and can't be visually rendered. Whether it could be rendered in other forms. In regard to something like literature, for example, is tricky. I mean, clearly narrative does things that visualization doesn't. And one of the reasons why something like Secula, it's for photographic project, but it uses the forms of narrative to link together photographs in order to do something that the single photograph is not, going to do. But we probably end up coming around back to the problem of abstraction and of what the limits of abstraction as a means of understanding abstraction. That clearly one could talk about capital via kind of logical languages of various kinds of mathematics and so on. What they communicate to us, though, to put it that way, is a different question, isn't it? And I think, and so then you turn back around to the problem of, well, how then do you render those something that can be understood in a more visceral way, I suppose.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I think it always has to do with a paradox. I mean,
not even understood, but just felt almost.
Yeah. So if you, I'm going to carry on hanging on to my Enlightenment rationality, but I take the point. Yeah. I mean, I think there is that. But I suppose I would say I think it's always going to be paradoxical. The question is what is a better or worse paradox in a sense, because there can't be an aesthetic of abstraction by definition.
Hi, Adrian. I wonder if you could expand a little bit about this, the human sensorium. You said something about expanding the human sensorium, and for me, that was something that seemed very imminent. And you presented, I think it was a quote from some sort of traditional quote from Chad, perhaps. The world dies from the north, which to me seemed a kind of very imminent expansion of the human sensorium, but I was slightly worried that it might be understood as something that goes on at the Institute of, I think it's called the Transhuman in Oxford, which is sort of the premise that technology has sort of accelerated to such an extent that the human in its current capacity cannot perceive it, so we have to expand the human in a kind of technological.
Yeah, I don't know those arguments, and I'd be suspicious, as you would be, I'm sure, about a kind of techno-optimism. I think it's just as likely to enslave you in different kinds of ways. And as for the definition of like what's human and not human, it's probably not an interesting argument either. I think but there is definitely I think a genuine aesthetic question, in the sense of, well, I think there's also an interesting aesthetic and a technical question around what it means, the relationship between, let's say, politics and experience, and what kind of category, what the meaning of experience is within political decision making, and for me that's a really critical question I don't have an answer to, but I think that would be one line of inquiry that might go some way to answering that. I think on the other hand is what I tried to mention before, which is a return of belief systems, or if not a return, because they've always been here, obviously. But as I say, a kind of more conscious understanding of the consequences of them, or even a kind of experimentation with them. I think, one of the people that we've tried to look at a lot is Eduardo Viveros de Castro, and the kind of, this amazing text on cosmological perspectivism, which is about Amerindian Indians. And those kinds of texts confront you with a radically different kind of worldview. And I think that these things are kind of interesting, and even within the architectural program at the RCA, and one of the ADSs that Platon is also organising with Godofredo and David is kind of looking at this kind of alternative ecological different alternative ecological conceptions, where ecology is not necessarily the natural bit, but is something social, technical, mental, psychological, at the same time. And what's at stake within those kinds of, those worldviews, those cosmologies, those sensoriums are different forms of life and experimentation with different forms of life. And ultimately, that's the most important ecological question. It's also the riskiest one, right? Because it's what touches upon, or threatens capitalism, potentially.
Yeah. Well, so that's just with the human sensorium, because one of the reasons to take an historical perspective on this, of course, is that people have been worried about this kind of stuff since the 19th century. You read exactly the same things, people talking about the growth of the metropolis in the late 19th century, and you read exactly the same things with people around cinema. So there is a kind of repetition to this. So we have to be wary, I think, of reaching. We have somehow uniquely reached a point at which we are unable to cope.
We've never really been able to cope.
Well, either we've never really been able to cope, or in fact we're immensely adaptable to these kinds of things. I think what we haven't got at the moment, or maybe we have it, I don't know it, is something like a kind of contemporary equivalent of Benjamin's work of art in the age of technological reproducibility. In which you're taking something like cinema and saying, okay, this is the manifestation of this new kind of human sensorium. It is the ways in which we take on board the shock experience of new modern experiences of the metropolis and so on, and turn that into a potentially progressive form, unconvincingly, retrospectively, as Benjamin's arguments for that look. I think it's the question of whether it will be able to do something similar today, I suppose. Which is why I suppose, going back to the previous session, I'd be very wary in that sense, something like the model of the theatre. I don't think pre-cinematic models of experience are what we need. We need post-cinematic models in that sense. But also those may not be strictly technological in that sense, as you're suggesting. But I think there is a paucity for various reasons of those kinds of, maybe they are speculative forms of thinking. In a way, Benjamin's essay is precisely speculative in that sense. This is what technological mediation of communism would somehow look like, as a speculative proposition.
I think there are. Yeah, I totally agree. But I think there are things that are unique now, and I think the kind of automation of those systems of calculation,
that's true.
Is really unique. I think the extent of our immersion in those systems of calculation is also really unique, and I think the kind of very, very deep relationship that now exists within those systems of abstraction and human life. So the relationship between abstraction and intimacy, which is set out in the Marx quote, has taken on a different kind of form. I think its kind of algorithmic, financial, automated character is, I think, distinct, at least from the 1970s till now. I think that.
Yeah, no, I would agree that is.
Well, I was just going to throw back in relation to this kind of idea of this paucity, but maybe we should start with post-colonial theory and feminism. Yeah. Because there wasn't very much referred to that, and I think that they're always dealing with these kind of issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
We did.
No, but come on.
But there's
also
real popular. Yeah.
The whole argument about the point of showing De Arping was that it's an anti-colonial protest in the middle of a climate conference. That's really what's at stake. That's also what's so stunning about that moment is that what is being consumed at the very frontier of a new system of calculation is the carbon dioxide capacity of the atmosphere. Yeah. So it's a colonial frontier. It's a purely post-colonial reading of climate change.
Nayan, then Joe. So just when I said it was the last question, everyone puts their hands up. Right. Joe is definitely the last. But Nayan first.
I'd just like you to extend your sentence a bit, because you clipped yourself. You said, I was just thinking about what you said about we need to have post-cinematic models. And I had two things in my head at that time. When you mean post-digital, that means we're in it. So we're in it. So we accept Bella or an argument. So what would be off the cuff a post-cinematic model for you.
Okay, well, very off the cuff. I mean, I was thinking of the model of Benjamin. So Benjamin looks at cinema. He says the cinema, in a sense, absorbs these distinctly modern experiences, distinctly contemporary experiences, and allows us a way to express those in some way through not only production of cinema, but the experience of watching cinema and so on. But of course, he also makes this huge and retrospectively, completely illegitimate thing that the new forms of collectivity associated with the cinema audience will produce the conditions for communism. Okay. That didn't turn out so well. But in a way, I suppose what I'm suggesting is that I mean by the post-cinematic more than simply the registering of the fact that we live in a digital world, that the internet exists and so on, but the sense of, what would be the speculative equivalent, I suppose, of that with the technologies that we have now. I mean, I think you can see that attempts at that in things like post-autonomy and so on, although I don't think they're terribly convincing, but I guess that would be the model that I have in mind. Does that make sense?
Perhaps shouldn't have asked it really. But thanks anyway.
No, it's a good question.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is a question or a sort of stream of consciousness in a way, because it ties in with the kind of idea of the glass snake as a kind of mythology. And then I'm looking at this microcosm image, and I'm thinking about the moving diagram that you showed, Adrian, earlier, and thinking that form of representation is a new form of representation. It's one that's relatively untested in art circles because it's so expensive to produce on the whole. And I went to a data processing centre that is supposed to have the highest pixel ratio to screen size in Europe, which is in Imperial College with a group of colleagues from here last week. Right. And they'd done a visualization of real-time Bitcoin transactions. And a colleague I was with and myself, we were saying, well, why does it look like a star map? And the data people who'd been putting in the data couldn't answer the question, because they almost took it as sort of self-evident that of course you'd do it as a star map. But it was just this strange sense that this sort of almost, I think, unconscious mapping of a cosmological scheme onto a data set. And then the whole thing was described to us in terms of gravity, which of course is ironic because Bitcoins have gravity. So there was this kind of incredible kind of collision of impossible schema, I suppose, that was being described with a very particular kind of narrative to naturalize the kind of exchanges that were going on. And it was about trying to give form to the relations and not the commodity relations. So I was just sort of...
Well, I think it's really complicated territory. I'm having conversations with Michaela. Where's Michaela's? Yeah, she's hiding there. The Fulda research group here at the RCA around potentially doing a project which is the projection of one of those simulations onto the inside surface of a dome. Because in architecture, at least, the inside surface of the dome is always the space that's inscribed with a specific cosmological perspective, whether it's kind of fresco in the tradition of the Renaissance and kind of Christian beliefs, or kind of abstract geometries or calligraphies in a kind of Islamic belief system, and looking at that kind of again the possibility of a kind of secular cosmology. It's a kind of contradiction in terms, but thinking about how we can just at least experiment with ways in which that kind of information and those kinds of aesthetics can make visceral, I think, ultimately the kinds of abstractions that we've both been talking about tonight. I think that's really, for me, a really interesting territory of aesthetic exploration.
I think just two quick comments on that. I mean, I think one is the question, I suppose, of whether what is being visualized there and what determines, in some sense, the form that it takes. And there's the contrary to that is a very interesting essay by a guy called Alex Galloway about why all network maps look the same. And it's true, but I'm not entirely convinced by it, but he has a strong argument that there is a reason why they all look the same, and you can't make them look any other way. I don't know if that's true, but there's something kind of interesting in that. It's true. The other, I suppose, is about visualization and understanding, isn't it? I mean, I think my frustration often, particularly with kind of art digital artworks around climate change that I've seen, there's a lot of them, they're very beautiful objects. You know, they're doing things with Arctic waters on, but they don't aid understanding whatsoever. So you might as well be feeding anything into it. You know, and it's just by virtue of reading the label that tells you that this is what you're seeing is being produced by this kind of information. So I mean, and that, you know, that's fine, I guess. But I think there has to be some. It's that thinking of, well, what would be the relation between that visceral, as we were saying, or that aestheticization, or that visualization, and certain kind of process of knowledge, not necessarily in the kind of, you know, in itself the kind of abstract enlightenment sense, but certainly understanding. I mean, I suppose that, going back to the cognitive mapping, even though it's the wrong term, that's kind of what it's trying to gesture towards, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think so it's not just aesthetic; it's a kind of curatorial, pedagogical,
yeah, absolutely.
Question, which is one of the things, which is really complicated, because what it does is it brings together things that vary in scale, that are separated, that in a way don't belong together, that it take place at different kinds of speeds. It brings together things like the lists that you were repeating, and it asks that we make sense of the connections between them. And I think that's really tough.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But also interesting, right?
Well, I think that might be the perfect place to finish. Just to say thanks a lot for your contributions tonight. It's been brilliant. I really enjoyed the discussion and your presentation, so thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just 1 second, just to add my thanks to Jaspar, David and Adrian. I think the challenge for us is the fact that we're able to stage such a discussion, convene such a discussion, and I suppose we have to ask ourselves how we bring these discussions into the kind of models that we perpetuate, both pedagogically and institutionally. I think that's quite an important challenge for us. Thank you very much, everybody. Just to say, our next Visual Cultures lecture will take place on the 8th of March, and that will see Marina Warner in conversation with Catherine David. Don't know we're entirely clear about the thematics around that yet, but these will emerge in good time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.